In the autumn of 2021, a convoy of refrigerated trucks rolled to a stop on the outskirts of a burned-out valley in central Oregon. Inside the trucks were plastic crates fitted with ventilation slits. Inside the crates were beavers. 63 animals pulled from irrigation canals, retention ponds, and flooded basements across 3 counties. Every one of them had been marked for lethal removal. Instead, they were about to be released into 22,000 acres of land that had not held permanent water in living memory. The valley had burned twice in 3 years, first in 2018, then again in 2020. What had once been a mosaic of wet meadows and willow thickets was now a moonscape of charred stumps and ash-grey soil. Hydrologists who surveyed the site called it a sponge with the water wrung out. The streams that used to feed it ran only during snowmelt. By July each year, they vanished into cracked earth. Groundwater monitoring wells showed the water table dropping by inches every season. The land was dying of thirst, in a state that gets more than 40 inches of rain a year. The plan was deceptively simple. Release the beavers, let them build. See if they could do in a decade what engineers estimated would cost $112 million to replicate with concrete and earth-moving equipment. Ranchers downstream called it a publicity stunt. County commissioners called it a liability. 5 years later, the same valley holds more than 3,800 acres of functioning wetland, supports a salmon run that had been functionally extinct, and stores enough water to supply a small city through the driest months of summer. Oregon did not get there by pouring money into the ground. It got there by trusting an animal that most people consider a pest. A beaver does not look like an engineer. It looks like a fat, flat-tailed rat with orange teeth. But those teeth are the key to everything. Beaver incisors are coated with iron compounds that make them harder than human enamel. They grow continuously throughout the animal's life. A beaver that does not chew will die because its own teeth will grow into its skull. So it chews. It chews trees, it chews branches, it chews saplings and shrubs and anything else made of wood. What it does with that wood is what makes it different from every other rodent on the planet. Beavers build dams, not because they learn to, because they cannot stop themselves. The urge is hardwired. Researchers in Sweden once played recordings of trickling water next to a dry concrete floor. The beavers in the enclosure piled sticks against the wall nearest the speaker. They could not see water. They could not smell water. They heard it, and they tried to stop it. That instinct, scaled up across thousands of animals and millions of acres, reshapes entire landscapes. A single beaver dam does not look like much. A pile of sticks and mud across a narrow channel. But that pile changes everything upstream and downstream. Water that was moving fast slows down. Water that was cutting a deeper channel spreads sideways instead. Sediment that was washing away settles behind the dam. The stream that was a single thread becomes a braid of channels and pools. Each pool holds water longer than the bare channel did. Each pool soaks moisture into the banks. Each pool raises the water table beneath it. Behind a mature dam complex, you can walk across ground that feels like a wet sponge. Dig down 6 inches and you hit saturated soil. That moisture stays in the ground through summer droughts. It feeds willows and sedges and grasses that would otherwise die by August. Those plants hold soil in place. Their roots create channels for water to percolate deeper. Their leaves shade the water and keep it cool. The whole system builds on itself. More water means more plants. More plants mean more building material. More building material means bigger dams. Bigger dams mean more water. This is not a theory. It is a measurable phenomenon that scientists have documented in watersheds across 3 continents. The valley that Oregon chose for its 2021 experiment had a history that made it both promising and risky. A century earlier, it had been beaver country. Trappers in the 1840s and 1850s pulled thousands of animals out of streams throughout the Cascade foothills. They sold the pelts to traders who shipped them to Europe for hat making. By 1900, beavers were functionally gone from most of Oregon. The streams they had dammed began to change. Without dams, water moved faster. Without pooling, sediment washed downstream. Without sediment, stream beds cut deeper. Deeper channels drained the surrounding meadows. Meadows that had held water for months dried out by midsummer. Willows died. Grasses died. The sponge-like soil that had absorbed snowmelt and released it slowly through the dry season turned into hardpan that shed water like pavement. Ranchers who arrived in the early 1900s found a landscape that looked productive but was already declining. They dug irrigation ditches. They drained remaining wetlands for pasture. They straightened streams to move water faster to their fields. Each intervention made the underlying problem worse. By the 1980s, salmon runs that had once numbered in the tens of thousands were down to a few hundred fish. The state listed them as threatened. Everyone blamed the dams on the main rivers. Almost nobody talked about the meadows. The fires of 2018 and 2020 stripped away what was left of the valley's resilience. The burn killed the remaining vegetation. Ash washed into the streams and smothered what fish habitat remained. The water table dropped another foot. Monitoring wells that had shown moisture at 6 feet now showed dry soil down to 12. A hydrologist who surveyed the site in early 2021 wrote in her report the valley had crossed a threshold. Without intervention, it would not recover on its own within any human timescale. The idea to use beavers came from a wildlife biologist named David Chen, who had been studying beaver reintroduction projects in Nevada and Utah. He had seen how animals released into degraded streams could rebuild them faster than any engineered solution. He had also seen how those projects failed when they started too small or released animals into places with no food or no flow. Chen spent 6 months surveying the burned valley. He identified 14 release sites where seasonal flow still existed, where willow stumps showed signs of potential regrowth, and where soil samples suggested the ground could still hold water if water was given a reason to stay. He presented his findings to state wildlife managers in the spring of 2021. The opposition was immediate and loud. Ranchers whose property bordered the valley argued that releasing beavers upstream was the same as releasing a flood. They pointed to culvert blockages on their own land. They pointed to flooded pastures and damaged fences. One farmer told a local newspaper that the state was about to turn his irrigation canal into a swamp. County commissioners worried about liability. If beaver dams cause flooding on private property, who would pay for the damage? Environmental groups raised different concerns. Releasing 63 animals onto 22,000 acres of burned lands seemed like a recipe for mass mortality. There was no established food source. There was no permanent water. The animals would starve or leave. Either way, the project would fail, and that failure would set back beaver restoration efforts for a generation. Chen answered both sets of objections with the same argument. The alternative was doing nothing. The valley was already dying. The ranchers' irrigation water came from streams that were drying up. The salmon were already functionally gone. Spending $112 million on engineered restoration was not going to happen. The state did not have the money. The federal government was not offering it. Beavers were cheap. Beavers were available. Beavers would work for free. In September 2021, the state approved a 3-year pilot project. Chen's team trapped nuisance beavers from across central Oregon and transported them to the valley. They released the animals in small groups at the 14 identified sites. Then they stepped back and watched. The first winter was brutal. Oregon had a dry year. The streams that Chen had counted on for seasonal flow barely ran at all. Aerial surveys in January 2022 showed that nearly half the released beavers had left their original sites. Some had moved downstream. Some had moved into adjacent drainages. Some had simply disappeared. Critics pointed to the dispersal as proof of failure. The land could not support the animals. The project was a waste of money. A county commissioner who had opposed the plan from the start called it an expensive lesson in wishful thinking. But the beavers that stayed were building. By March 2022, drone footage showed 23 new dams across the valley. Most were small. Some were barely visible. But each one was holding water that would otherwise have been gone within days of falling as rain. That water was spreading into side channels. It was soaking into banks. It was sitting in shallow pools where no pools had existed for decades. The following winter was wetter. Snow piled up in the mountains. When it melted in April, water flooded down the valley's main channel. Without the beaver dams, it would have roared through in a week and left the ground as dry as before. Instead, the dams slowed it. They spread it. They forced it into side channels and backwaters and seeps. By late May, monitoring wells showed the water table had risen by nearly 3 feet in the areas behind the largest dam complexes. Now the beavers had material to work with. Willows that had been charred stumps 2 years earlier were sending up new shoots. Sedges were colonizing the edges of ponds. Cottonwood seedlings were sprouting in the saturated soil. The animals cut those willows and wove them into their dams. They reinforced structures that had been flimsy with fresh branches and mud. By the end of 2023, the largest complex in the valley held 11 interconnected dams stretching across more than 800 feet of what had been a single dry channel. The salmon came back in the fall of 2024. Not many. A few dozen fish nosing up the main channel looking for places to spawn. But the places existed now. Behind the beaver dams, pools had formed that were deep enough and cool enough to hold fish through the summer. Gravel bars had accumulated where sediment had settled. The water was cold because the willows shaded it. It was oxygenated because the pools were connected by riffles and small cascades. State biologists who surveyed the run counted 47 adult salmon. The year before, they had counted 3. The year before that, 0. It was too early to call it a recovery, but it was enough to call it a beginning. By the spring of 2025, the numbers were harder to argue with. Satellite imagery showed 3,800 acres of the original 22,000 displaying wetland characteristics. There was standing water. There was green vegetation. There were the dark, braided lines of beaver channels cutting across what had been bare grey soil. Monitoring wells showed water table increases averaging 4.2 feet across the core project area. Some wells showed increases of more than 7 feet. The economic comparison was stark. The beaver project had cost approximately $940,000 over 4 years. That covered trapping, transport, monitoring equipment, staff time, and public outreach. The engineered alternative that had been proposed in 2019 carried a price tag of $112 million. On a per-acre basis, the beaver approach cost about $43. The engineered option would have cost more than $5,000 per acre. And the engineered option would have required ongoing maintenance. The beavers were maintaining themselves. Economists who analysed the project estimated that the restored wetlands were providing roughly $6.3 million per year in ecosystem services by 2025. That included flood control, water filtration, carbon storage, wildlife habitat, and the cooling effect of increased vegetation. In less than 5 years, the beavers had generated more value than the project had cost to run. The Oregon success did not happen in isolation. Across the American West, similar projects were showing similar results. In Nevada, beavers released into degraded streams in the Elko Highlands had raised water tables by an average of 5 feet over 8 years. In Washington, a project on the Methow River had used beaver dam analogues to jumpstart restoration before releasing animals. Within 4 years, the analogues had been incorporated into real beaver dams, and the stream was holding water through droughts that dried up neighbouring channels. Scientists were beginning to assemble a clearer picture of what beavers actually do to a watershed. A 2023 meta-analysis led by hydrologist Emily Fairfax compiled data from 147 study sites across North America and Europe. The findings were consistent. Streams with beaver activity stored 30 to 50% more water per unit length than streams without beavers. Flood peaks were reduced by 15 to 40%. Summer low flows were increased by similar margins. Groundwater recharge rates were measurably higher. The fire connection was proving equally significant. Beaver wetlands do not burn well. The saturated soil and standing water creates natural firebreaks. Fairfax had documented cases in California where wildfires burned to the edge of beaver complexes and stopped. The green corridors along beaver dam streams stood out in satellite imagery of burned landscapes, like ribbons of life crossing a dead world. In Oregon, the 2024 fire season provided an unplanned test. A lightning-sparked blaze swept across the hills east of the project valley. It burned more than 8,000 acres before crews contained it. The burn scar stopped at the edge of the beaver wetlands. Drone footage showed charred hillsides giving way to green meadows within the space of a few hundred feet. The beavers had built a firebreak without knowing what fire was. Not everyone was convinced. Ranchers downstream from the Oregon project continued to report problems. Beavers had colonized 2 irrigation canals outside the project boundaries. They had dammed a culvert under a county road. They had flooded a pasture that a farmer had used for hay. The damages were real. The complaints were legitimate. State managers responded by installing flow devices at problem sites. These are simple structures that pipe water through beaver dams at controlled levels. They let the dam stay while preventing flooding from reaching nuisance heights. The technology has been used for decades. It works, but it requires maintenance and monitoring. Someone has to check the pipes. Someone has to clear debris. The cost is not zero. Critics also pointed out that the Oregon Valley was not typical. It had the right soil, it had seasonal flow, it had burned recently, which meant no established trees that beavers might damage. Not every degraded watershed in America has those characteristics. The $43 per acre cost comparison would not hold in places where soils were sandy or rocky, where flow was too seasonal to support dam building, or where existing vegetation was too thick for beavers to clear. These objections were fair. Beavers are not a universal solution, but they are a solution that is being ignored on a massive scale. Every year, wildlife agencies across the United States authorize the killing of thousands of beavers, classified as nuisances. Most of those animals die without anyone asking whether they could have been relocated. Most of those deaths represent lost potential. The question is not whether beavers can fix every watershed. The question is how many watersheds they could fix if anyone bothered to try. Oregon is now 5 years into a project that was supposed to last 3. The monitoring continues. The beavers continue. The valley holds water through summers that used to see it bone dry by August. Salmon spawn in pools that did not exist when the project started. Willows grow thick along channels that were bare gravel 5 years ago. The water table sits 4 feet higher than it did before the animals arrived. At 10 years, will the system stabilize or keep expanding? At 20 years, will it need human management or sustain itself? At 50 years, will anyone remember that this was once a moonscape of ash and cracked earth? Nobody knows. The research has not been done. The timescales have not been tested. What Oregon has proven is that the first 5 years can work. What happens after that is a question for the beavers to answer. Somewhere in the valley right now, an animal with orange teeth is listening for the sound of running water. When it hears that sound, it will start to build. It cannot help itself. That instinct carved wetlands across an entire continent for 10,000 years before humans arrived. It is still carving them now, in every stream where beavers are allowed to stay. The trucks that rolled into that burned valley in 2021 were carrying 63 animals marked for death. They released them into land that had been written off as dead. 5 years later, both the animals and the land are alive. The cost was less than $1 million. The value is beyond calculation.